Thank you so much for having us here. My name is Federica, and I'm here with Steve. Steve and I have been working on non-suicidal self-injury on Tumblr for almost a year now, and today we're going to present our mixed approach of ethnography and network analysis to study complex hashtag clusters. And just as a slight content warning, we will be talking about non-suicidal self-injury, but there will be no images of injuries. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI for short? It is the act of deliberate body tissue injury for non-suicidal purposes. So that can include things like cutting, scratching, burning, or bruising the skin. This behavior is highly stigmatized, and the high stigmatization leads to mostly anonymous activity on the internet, most notably social media. And on social media, you can see that people who self-injure use hashtags to seek out NSSI content, curate it for others, but also obscure it to the point that they can avoid content moderation or deletion. Next slide, please. So we have an NSSI project at Western that consists of an interdisciplinary team of researchers from public health, epidemiology, anthropology, sociology, psychology, computer science, and more. And our overall project objectives are: one, to understand the role of emotional regulation in NSSI, two, to solidify an approach for integrating diverse forms of research, and three, document effective ways to use social media as a health promotion tool. And Steve and I are working in a smaller team of researchers who look at NSSI and social media specifically. And so our team leads for that are Dr. Gerald McKinley and Dr. Dan Lazat. So we kind of combine the ethnography and computer science approach. So Gerald and I were spearheading the online ethnography on Tumblr. So we did that from May to July 2021. So that was about 3 months. And we used online ethnography as a suitable method for the study of social media community, and we chose Tumblr specifically because Tumblr has vast anonymity options for its users, which really invites a lot of content from people who self-injure. And Tumblr also only minimally restricts hashtags that are related to NSSI. That's like very different from platforms such as Instagram, where hashtags that are known to be related to NSSI are kind of shut down, and Tumblr really still gives us the ability to look at recent activity in those hashtags. And so on the image on the right there, you see Tumblr's community guidelines from 2020. And you can see that Tumblr bans content that actively promotes or glorifies self-harm, but also acknowledges that dialogue about these behaviors is incredibly important. And online communities can be extraordinarily helpful for people struggling with these difficult conditions. And so the platform is kind of towing the line between content moderation and open discussion, which really is an interesting position to take because it kind of leaves the middle ground for people who self-injure to still post about self-injury, but without really knowing where the line stops, kind of. We don't really know how Tumblr is doing content moderation. There is a report self-harm button there that you can see. It's on the screenshot. So we know that users can report instances of self-harm on Tumblr, but we don't really know if there's also an automated process for data deletion, basically. And so how we collected data on Tumblr was basically manually. We collected hashtags, accounts, and posts. We used systematic search, so we used keywords or hashtags that we already knew or assumed were related to NSSI. And then the algorithm on Tumblr kind of suggested, based on what we were looking for and following, we basically recommended more hashtags, more accounts, and more posts for us to look at. So Tumblr was almost a little too helpful in exposing us to NSSI content. And in this way, we collected 182 hashtags, 70 Tumblr accounts, and 241 Tumblr posts. And at the same time, we kept field notes in the form of observational logs, kind of to document our experience navigating this content for the first time. Next slide, please. Okay, so for our theoretical approaches, We first looked at communities of practice, which are based on shared actions or interests rather than demographics or proximity. So you can imagine a neighborhood as a traditional community. They share the same space, they might share the same demographics or at least similar demographics, versus Tumblr users who self-injure as a community of practice, because we don't really know much about their demographics, especially since most people who self-injure and post content online do so anonymously. And so, what really unites them for the purposes of our study as a community is the act of self injury. So, we're centering the practice, and that can also help relieve a lot of stigma in NSSI studies, because we're really not looking at who are the people who self injure, we're looking at how do they share content and how do they talk about self injury. And so the other thing we're looking at is complexity theory as the study of complex adaptive systems, meaning systems that are diverse, so complex in their makeup, and in flux, adaptive to changes. And I chose the image of the iceberg model here to kind of convey the idea that what we see at the surface level is really just a momentary glimpse into much larger complex structures that are under the surface. And so now, where's the complexity in NSSI on Tumblr? Next slide, please. I kind of unrelated to the study, my thesis has nothing to do with NSSI on Tumblr. I found a quote from linguistic anthropologist Jan Blumert, who writes in 2013 that a sociolinguistic system is a complex system characterized by internal and external forces of perpetual change, operating simultaneously in an unpredictable mutual relationships. It is therefore always dynamic, never finished, never bounded, and never completely and definitively describable either. By the time that we have finished our description, the system will have changed. And I thought this quote was really interesting and relevant to the study of NSSI because what we're looking at are hashtags, and hashtags are essentially language or are consisting of language. And the language of self-injury really keeps changing as the community keeps adapting. And so, for example, there was a study in 2015 that found certain hashtags on Tumblr related to NSSI that we also looked at for our study 7 years later, or 6 years later at that point. But those hashtags didn't really seem to be in use anymore. And so what we find then in 2015 is like a glimpse into the system, and what we're doing now is another glimpse into the system. So our ethnographic findings really only capture a moment within the complexity. If you were to do the study again in a few years, you might find completely different hashtags. And so there's this flux that we really need to keep in mind when we study these things. So there's a high fluctuation of NSSI hashtags on Tumblr. And as you saw earlier, we were able to manually compile 182 hashtags, but that really is just the start of the complexity. And so Steve and Dan helped us with the computational methods to kind of show the visualized patterns of complexity on a much larger scale. So the 182 hashtags kind of snowballed into something much larger. And so I'll pass it on to Steve to walk you through that.
Yeah, thanks, Fifi. So yeah, as Fifi mentioned, the ethnographic work was really able to kind of start off the research, but it really only scratched the surface of what exists within the complexity of these hashtags and how they're used. So we recognize that more computationally intensive methods were required. And so we had an idea that we would combine kind of data mining methods with network analysis to further understand kind of what hashtags are used in the context of NSSI and how they are used together to kind of form these communities of practice. And so using the Tumblr API, so API is just a way that systems allow access to data. We developed a base data mining strategy around kind of the findings of the ethnographic work. Sorry, is there a hand raised? Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. So we started with the list of hashtags that were identified from the ethnographic work. And for each hashtag, we gathered a list of posts that kind of used the hashtag. And then, each post will have a set of hashtags that are used. And from there, we were able to curate a new list of unique hashtags from the posts. And then we could kind of repeat this process to ensure that duplicate posts are removed. And we can repeat this process over and over to kind of ensure that we are getting an exhaustive list of hashtags that are used. So we did this data collection over the same 2-month period as the ethnographic work. And we were able to find over 40,000 posts that were using NSSI related hashtags. And we identified over 80,000 unique hashtags that were used. An overwhelming number of these hashtags were only used once. So really, there are a smaller number of hashtags that are being used more frequently. And the most common hashtags by frequency we found were vent, TW blood, blood TW, trauma core, and personal. So it's important to note here that TW blood and blood TW are variations on each other. And this is one way that we found that individuals are commonly using to kind of use coded language and kind of change how they're kind of using these hashtags and forming communities. So in terms of the network, 2 networks can really be realized. One is a full network of all the hashtags. This is really a work in progress because it is so computationally intensive. But the full network can really show us the full picture of the complexity within the hashtags and how they're used with one another and how they're related to one another. But we can also create hashtag specific networks that help us develop an understanding of smaller sub-communities within this larger community of practice surrounding NSSI. With the networks, we can also use algorithms to cluster the nodes together. So we used what is known as the open ORD algorithm to cluster the nodes based on the degree centrality. So degree centrality is just the number of connections each node has. And then for visibility sake, we were able to use a color gradient based on the degree as well. So deeper pink means higher degrees or more connections. And the size is based on what is known as eigenvalue centrality or eigencentrality, which is another network metric, which is derived from the degree and the degree of the nodes that a given node is connected to. Yes, it's very confusing, but you can interpret it as essentially a measure of importance or influence within the network. And so we have 2 examples of kind of these sub-networks or hashtag-specific networks that we can show you. The first one is surrounding this trauma core hashtag. And immediately we can identify kind of some thematic clusters that appear. And again, the eigencentrality also gives insight into which hashtags might be more prominently used to form these communities surrounding our what I call a seed tag. So our seed tag here is trauma core, and we see that tags like vent core are very closely related to trauma core. In terms of the thematic clusters, we see kind of mental health related clusters, which are not surprising in the grand scheme of things. But I do want to highlight that there is an interesting thematic cluster that forms around Pokemon. And it is left to be discovered why this cluster kind of forms. but uh, we can start to kind of develop an understanding from the wonderful ethnographic work that has been done. So although there are a lot of aspects that may not be immediately apparent or aspects that we don't understand, we can take guidance from the ethnographic work um, to further investigate and start to understand why certain themes might come up.
And just to add to that, for example, we can see a lot of anime content in NSSI content on Tumblr and probably larger online networks. Not necessarily we can't really provide a reason for why that is yet, but there is work that's done by other researchers on the connection between self-injury and anime. And so just so you know why Pokemon might show up, there is a connection. We see a lot of Hello Kitty content, for example, as well. So like there is a lot of connection between certain forms of visual imagery with NSSI online.
Yep. And so our second network is around our seed tag of Barcode. So immediately you can see that it's quite extensive. So breaking it down, we do find a general cluster around our seed tag. So again, the clusters are formed by based on the degree or the number of connections each node has. And we do find thematic clusters in this network as well. So we have a thematic cluster surrounding economy, money, government generally. So maybe we can consider this as perhaps finance related hashtags. Further, we have hashtags surrounding kind of art and general mental illness and venting as well, and self-harm. And we do have a good cluster of hashtags that are very similar to our seed tag. And this really shows evidence that there is that there exists a logical evolution of these hashtags that we can kind of go in and further investigate.
And sorry, I'm just gonna add there that barcode is meant to be an image of what self-injury scars look like on the body. So barcode is really a metaphor for self-injury, but not all of these hashtags that are visible in this network need to necessarily be related to self-injury. They're just related to the seed tag of barcode that was used. So in the previous slide, I think you have a cluster there that is more specifically related to self-injury. And that is where barcode as a metaphor comes in.
Mm-hmm. And so these computational methods really do allow us to exhaustively collect data surrounding the hashtags that are used. One important thing to note is that from the computational methods, we were able to closely parallel the findings that were drawn from the ethnographic work, which doesn't happen too often, but is very, very important for us, which means that this computational method is very similar to us going in and manually finding these hashtags and curating the list manually. And so, again, there are many aspects of the hashtags that we may not understand immediately, but the basis of the ethnographic work can give us a way in understanding and diving more deeply into kind of the hidden meanings behind the use of hashtags, because very often we do see that individuals will use very coded language to kind of congregate together. So you may be wondering, what is the point of all of this? So the main motivations of this were kind of from the point of public health, and in trying to think of maybe public health interventions or prevention measures, we kind of need to develop an understanding of um, who these individuals are and how they're kind of interacting with each other. And so these computational methods really allow us to more easily identify the online NSSI communities and to develop better understanding of kind of the importance of community among these individuals. And then in kind of the broader public health context, we do need to first understand the individuals and the communities they partake in to really understand how best we can help them. And so the preliminary work here kind of provides a framework for developing kind of a deeper understanding of the use of hashtags. So moving forward, in terms of future work, we plan on kind of diving deeper into these thematic clusters to understand why certain themes are popping up from the point of view of kind of the ethnography and the individual. And we do plan on kind of mapping out these networks over time to kind of understand if there is some sort of system or if we can discern kind of a logic behind how these hashtags are evolving so that we can kind of better understand which communities will form in the future moving forward. So, yep, and these are our references, and we welcome any questions if we have time.